In just a few hours, President Biden is expected to take his first steps when it comes to fulfilling campaign promises related to health care. The president is set to sign a series of executive orders to reverse health policies from the Trump administration. The actions cover a range of issues, including getting more Americans insured and removing curbs on abortion counseling. This comes as President Biden uses his executive authority to issue several other sweeping directives, including a new government effort to fight climate change. Ed O'Keefe reports on that.
In my view, we've already waited too long to deal with this climate crisis. We can't wait any longer.
President Biden is planning to make the fight against climate change a core part of U.S. foreign policy for the first time. He's also establishing a White House Office of Domestic Climate Policy and ordering the government to begin buying zero-emissions vehicles.
This will mean 1 million new jobs in the American automobile industry.
The Biden approach is a big change from former President Trump, who pulled the United States out of the global Paris Climate Accord and rolled back more than 100 environmental regulations, arguing they slowed economic growth.
I was elected to represent the citizens of Pittsburgh, not Paris.
With an economy already hit hard by COVID-19, the president said his plan will create jobs.
When I think of climate change, I think of, and the answers to it, I think of jobs.
Mr. Biden is also freezing permits to drill for oil in offshore waters and barring any new oil and gas leases on federal lands. Critics like Todd Staples of the Texas Oil and Gas Association say that decision will lead to big job losses.
Not producing it here means it makes us dependent on other countries for this energy source, because there's a great deal of infrastructure that is necessary for renewable energies.
But newly appointed U.S. climate envoy John Kerry says the changes will lead to economic benefits.
There are countless economic analyses now that show that it is now cheaper to deal with the crisis of climate than it is to ignore it.
All right, for more on this, let's bring in Ed O'Keefe. So, Ed, as we mentioned, the president is planning on signing a series of executive orders related to healthcare policy, including reopening the healthcare.gov website for a special enrollment period from mid-February to mid-May. As you remember, that system was created by former President Barack Obama's 2010 Affordable Care Act. So how significant is this as millions of Americans deal with the loss of health insurance that are due to job cuts that have happened over the pandemic?
Yeah, well, actually, it's funny you say millions. There was a call just a few minutes ago with reporters to sort of preview this, and they couldn't quite specify how many they think could potentially be open to applying for new government-backed plans. I'm sure that data is out there somewhere, but they didn't have it, at least. The idea here, as you said, allow that government-run website and the government-backed plans to become available during this pandemic, during a time when there are millions of Americans potentially out there who've lost their jobs and their health care, or one or the other, and allow them to do this. This is something that Democrats were calling for last year as the pandemic began. There was a call to do it over the summer and to extend the enrollment period in the fall. Remember, now President Biden was a big supporter and seller of the Affordable Care Act as it was coming together back in 2010. People might remember he turned to President Obama the day it was signed and said it's a big something deal. And so this is one of their first attempts to continue that law, to bolster it, to protect it. And of course comes as there are at least 2 Supreme Court challenges right now to aspects of it. The other interesting healthcare development is one that goes back and forth depending on which party's in power. We've seen a few of these over the last few days. Executive orders designed to put something back together or take it apart. This one takes apart something that was put in place by Republican presidents. It's called the Mexico City Rule, or the Global Gag Rule. And what it essentially does is put up a federal ban on, or a ban on nonprofits around the world who provide health services and provide abortion services or counseling from getting any U.S. funding for their work. Democrats rescinding that today, the president rescinding that consistent with the president and with the Democratic Party's support for abortion rights. This is, again, something that goes back and forth. Trump put it back in place, Biden taking it away. And we've seen a series of those on a host of issues over the last few days, and we'll continue to see a few more in the coming days.
Ed, we also want to ask you about reports that the Biden administration will likely delay a series of executive orders and actions on immigration. What do you know about that?
Well, again, this is one of those issues that is undoing or redoing some things that had been undone or done by the last guy. In this case, it's immigration executive orders and other actions that would, among other things, try to finally put together a program to reunite those migrant families that had been separated at the U.S.-Mexico border by the zero-tolerance policy put in place by the Trump administration. Remember, there have been reports of a few hundred children who still have not been reunited with their families. Then candidate Biden, in the closing days of the campaign, made a vow to do it on day one. Then there was a memo before the inauguration saying it's probably going to come by mid-February. There were advocates here in town expecting this would all be announced tomorrow. There are now signals it may be delayed into next week. This comes, of course, as the Senate is still working on confirming the new Homeland Security and Health and Human Services secretaries amid all these other changes that are being made in policy across the government. But we are assured by administration officials that there are several notable changes or announcements coming on this. They just may not be coming by tomorrow. The other would, of course, make some changes to asylum rules and address some other Trump-era decisions and try to sort of begin to put in place some of the changes that the White House would like to see enacted later this year through legislation. Remember, the president on day one did send up a massive immigration reform proposal to Congress, which said, we'll take a look at it, but don't expect anything quickly, given that we've got a lot of other things to worry about first.
So the other thing, Ed, the president's COVID-19 response team held its first briefing yesterday. And as you know, health advisors warned that the U.S. will remain especially vulnerable without the quick passage of a relief bill by Congress. So where are you hearing the negotiations are right now?
Yeah, and you're going to hear that on everything he does. Well, we can only do so much, but Congress has to help us out here and must provide the money. That will be the clause added to almost every sentence from an administration officials until Congress acts. We know that there is an important lunchtime meeting today between some White House advisors, Jeff Zients, who leads the COVID response, Brian Deese, who's the top economic advisor, and the Senate Democratic Caucus, who is holding one of their weekly lunches, as they do. They will discuss this $1.9 trillion COVID relief package that the president has proposed, and that is facing already some stiff resistance and skepticism from members of both parties for its size and scope, for things it does and does not do. There were reports this morning in other outlets that there is already serious talk of splitting up this $1.9 trillion deal and trying to put it into two perhaps more politically digestible proposals. But very quickly this morning, via tweet, there were administration officials saying no, there is no current plan to do that, and that it should be done in a massive package like the one the president is proposing. Let's just say this. The president himself earlier this week signaled this is likely going to take weeks, and he's correct. The problem with negotiating in Washington in this era is that a lot of it is done through the press and through social media, and so every little twist and turn can be misinterpreted or blown out of proportion. Are things being discussed that might change what the president put on paper this week? Absolutely. Is what he proposed going to be passed as written? Absolutely not. So this is part of the wheeling and dealing and negotiating that goes on between a White House and Congress, between members of both parties. This is how it's supposed to be done. And while there are millions of Americans out there who are awaiting certainty and some sense of aid from the federal government, more of it, and perhaps some other changes, just know that it's probably going to take, and I said this to you guys earlier this week, probably going to take until at least early March that legislation starts getting passed and changes start getting made.
Ed, I want to ask you about one more thing that almost got immediate pushback. The administration announced a freeze on new oil and gas leases. Right away, the fossil fuel industry started reacting negatively to that. States that depend on those industries threatened lawsuits. Just how is the Biden administration planning to move forward with their plans, but also, alleviate the concerns about massive job losses within the oil and coal industry?
Well, their attitude is bring it on. And as you saw in our report there, their belief is that if you actually start to address these things, eventually there will be a broader economic benefit, and that there is a need to address these things now, because to not do it now is going to make it more expensive later. Bottom line, as you saw, oil industry groups, other energy industry organizations are already saying this is going to lead to job losses in states like Texas, lost tax revenue in places like Wyoming and New Mexico that rely on those leases, oil and gas drilling leases, for tax revenue. There are others who are concerned about the lack of new offshore oil drilling. Of course, there are several states along the Gulf Coast and the East Coast that are pushing to ban it altogether, but there are others that want to continue to see it. Biden administration's attitude is bring it on, that they believe this is something that has to change, that will change under their leadership, And it's something that they're not only going to do through executive action, but that they will be pushing Congress to do as well. The question is, or the concern is, you have to be sensitive to this, because as industry executives and some state leaders have already pointed out, it's potentially going to lead to job losses in states where more traditional energy resources are still big employers. And, you know, the administration turns around and says, look, before the pandemic, and this is true, before the pandemic, one of the biggest job creators, or one of the industries that was creating the most jobs, was the renewable energy industry. People who were installing new energy efficient equipment or developing those technologies. And they expect that as the pandemic ends and we return to some sense of normalcy, that it'll go back to that kind of arrangement, and we'll see. It's a classic sort of, you know, economic and science fight, and one that we're likely to continue to have for several years to come.
It's no Godzilla versus Kong, but I see the analogy. I have the imagery in my head. Ed, thank you so much.
Take care, guys.